Alright guys, we got one from Bitcoin Voice. Here we go. Go follow.
Mexico just saw massive protests against their liberal president, Sheinbaum, which got so intense their police even brought back the Greek phalanx. But oddly, the mainstream media skewed this story from the perspective of the accused narco president. It'll be interesting to see which outlets view this from the citizen side and which writers report this from the perspective of the cartels. As all of this started when a Mexican mayor took on the cartels, only to be assassinated days later. The Trump administration began planning going into Mexico with the military, stating the cartels run their government.
Because the cartels have a tremendous grip on Mexico and the politicians and the people that get elected.
To which Mexican President Sheinbaum stated something to the effect of, "We must protect the cartels from fascism."
Entonces, estos llamados autoritarios, porque son autoritarios, es ir hacia el fascismo.
Now obviously we're not able to translate this one-to-one, because if their president really claimed protect the rights of the cartels, that would be insane, which is exactly how the Mexican citizens are responding, as their president quickly built massive barricades in anticipation of Saturday's protest, to which it originally appeared to be genuinely peaceful, as they chanted against their alleged narco president.
Narco presidenta! Narco presidenta!
Yeah, One Piece.
Narco presidenta!
And aside from all the One Piece pirate flags, it is somewhat refreshing to see citizens protest while waving their own country's flag. But when these Gen Z protesters made it to the walls outside the National Palace, they attempted to scale the makeshift barricades, later trying to tear down the gates, only to be met with a rainbow of OC sprays. But this didn't deter them, as they kept at it, chanting, "Yes, we can." As I would say their protesters were more serious than American idiots in their inflatable suits, but even they had an activist in an astronaut costume, which doesn't completely negate the seriousness of this, but it does show how performative these protests are becoming, as they did eventually break down their barricades. Using the other gates to face off with the police. Successfully taking away other parts of the barricade.
What happened, man?
This was just the beginning, as there were still hundreds of riot police now forming a sort of Greek phalanx behind their shields, to which the rioters tried to break through.
Échale, échale, bótala.
Implementing some not so successful tactics.
Emily.
Until the police phalanx began to advance on their position. And when they finally clashed, it didn't go so well for the Gen Z rioters, with some of the riot police being snatched by the mob and beaten. In other instances where the rioters fell behind police lines, also being beaten. But eventually, the riot police were able to push back the mob outside the National Palace, completely clearing out the courtyard, restoring order. Now, when the Daily Mail covered the riot, they reported on the Gen Z protesters calling for the president's resignation, as 20 of them were arrested for battery, assault, and robbery, with 60 officers also being injured, with 40 of them being sent to the hospital, as President Sheinbaum accused right-wing groups being behind this. And although she wasn't actually at the National Palace as this happened, she later denounced the Gen Z protest and violence that occurred. Now, I don't suddenly trust the mainstream media, especially to translate another language and to tell me what's actually happening, but judging from the massive amounts of people waving the Mexican flag against their far-left president, I'm somewhat inclined to believe this president isn't actually representing the people. Where recently, a conservative senator from Mexico actually came to our media to say the same.
Is Mexico a narco state?
Yes, it is. And we all Mexicans know about it. And Mexicans are afraid of the alliance between the Mexican government and the cartels that have infested our nation.
Can you explain this alliance between the president, her party, the Morena party, and the cartels?
The cartels have given so much money to these politicians, narco politicians of Morena, to get into office, to get the power. So they protect, the Mexican government protects the cartels. That is why President Sheinbaum doesn't want the strong American leadership to help Mexico defeat the cartels. And also Sheinbaum doesn't want the rest of the world to know what is happening here in Mexico. We are on the steps to be the next Venezuela.
Which really makes you wonder why places like left-wing Bloomberg see this story and write their article from the perspective of how can President Sheinbaum stop these protests, and not why does most of Mexico believe they have a narco president? So if you appreciate my concise, lighthearted commentary on the tragic status that is today's reality, subscribe to Decoy Voice.
Decoy Voice.